Today, we have a special guest on the stream, Derek Dawson from Chicago Roar, the Chicago Regional Organizing for Anti-Racism. Derek is a program coordinator and workshop facilitator. Today, we're diving into the topic of anti-racism, and hopefully we'll get into the point where we also talk about how it plays into mental health.
The goal here is Derek is brilliant and experienced and has so much to share on this topic that Mike and I both care a lot about and don't know as much about as he does. So he's going to be presenting with us all, and then we're kind of going to be learning alongside you guys and using some of the language that we've developed together to translate some of these concepts in ways that might work best for those of us who have been here and worked on this language together. Just a quick refresher.
So I've had the pleasure of attending one of Derek's workshops, and it really was eye-opening. And Derek, if you could just give us a little primer of what workshops are about, how they get to the work, that'd be wonderful to just give us the context.
Sure, I can try to encapsulate what we do. Chicago Regional Organizing for Anti-Racism is a local program of a national organization called Crossroads Anti-Racism Organizing and Training. So Crossroads has been doing anti-racism work at a systemic and institutional level for about 30 years. We were established at about 1985. And we were established by some Lutheran pastors and a couple of others in the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America in the 1980s, who came up with the idea that something needed to be done about racism at a systemic and an institutional level. So they started doing that, and they found out at the time that people who attend church also go to work, and they have jobs, and they do other things outside of the workplace. And so the work we were doing within the church sort of carried out to all kinds of other institutions, governments, nonprofits, et cetera. And what the focus was and became even more concerned about was racism at a systemic and institutional level. And what that means is that we are often socialized and convinced that racism and personal prejudice are the same thing. That racism is about whether Black people and white people like each other or not. And we recognize that framework is highly problematic for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that it does not take into consideration any power dynamics whatsoever. Another dynamic that's problematic is that it also frames racism within a Black-white binary. That racism is just about the relationship between Black people and white people. And if we could all just get along, if we could all just know people of a different race, then we will arrive at some kind of nirvana and this would all go away. And then there are all kinds of myths around that as well. Like racism is about some hooded people in the South who are part of the Klan, or racism is about those folks who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. And all of these things are aspects of racism or parts of racism, but our work is around the structures and the systems and how we all participate in those structures and systems. You know, we hear these conversations about racism is about a few bad apples. And if we chase down those bad apples and get rid of them, then we would have done something about racism. We've been chasing after bad apples for centuries. What we don't do is think about the fact that the trees are rotten. And if we don't get at the root of the problem, we will always be distracted by chasing after these bad apples. So our work is around helping people understand that. By helping people understand that, as Toni Morrison said, chasing after those bad apples is a mere distraction. Because as long as we're chasing after those bad apples, we will never think about the systems and the structures that actually guide us. We will never think about the history, which we argue started hundreds of years before this country was even a nation, with things called the Papal Bulls and the edicts from Europe in the 15th, 16th century. If we don't think about the historic nature of racism, if we don't think about it in its deeply rooted aspects, then we will never address it adequately, which is why we're still having the same conversations in 2021, which is why we're still having young men murdered like George Floyd, while young women of color are still being killed like Sandra Bland. Right? If we keep chasing after bad apples, we will always be distracted by that endeavor and never get at the root of the problem, which is the misuse of power by systems and institutions, by our definition. So our work is around exploring that misuse of power and the power dynamics that undergird systemic racism. And we do that through workshops, we do that through conversations, we do that in any number of ways. But our mission is to dismantle systemic racism by focusing on systems, institutions that we all participate in. If you think about it, our systems and institutions create, manage, and distribute the resources that we all need to do life. And we all participate in institutions. In fact, at Crossroads in Chicago Roar, we are pro-institution because of how powerful they are in our lives. We could not be having this conversation without all kinds of institutions, telecommunications, schools, government. But all of those are complicit, and we, by our participation, are also complicit. So we need to understand it at that level in order to address it. And in short, that's what our work is at Crossroads in Chicago Roar, to begin to address those systemic issues, as well as personal issues, as well as things like psychology and all of those things play a role, because we are individuals who participate in the life of our institutions. But we have always been encouraged to only think about it at an individual level, and that is not sufficient. So that's our work.
I love that. We, like I mentioned, Derek and I talked last week, and I felt a connection. And I have to say that I've been asked. I'm a mixed race person. I'm mostly white passing, but not for people who actually like sit down and look and talk at me usually. So I've been asked. I've been in a lot of spaces that are predominantly white, and asked a lot of times, like, do you think person X is racist or action Y is racist? And my response has always been, look, I'm racist because I participate in racist systems. I really don't care about having a discussion about whether an individual is racist or whether they're doing what they're doing for racially motivated reasons, because that's just, it doesn't do much, And when you're talking about history and getting at the root of things, we have a concept in psychology that we call intergenerational transmission, where a person learns to do a thing for whatever reason. It serves some purpose for them theoretically at some point. But then they teach that to their children, and then their children do it their whole lives and then teach that to their children. It gets passed on and on and on. And so one of the things we talk about a lot here, we use the phrase question the premise, which means take those things that your attention has not been guided to because they've never caused you a problem, because you have enjoyed the privilege of not needing to pay attention to these things, and spend some of your attentional resources, your time and energy, all the resources we talk about, exploring those premises and saying, wait a second, where did this start? Why did this start? Why are we doing this?
Right.
I don't know if that's something, because of course my next question is, what are some of the premises that you see people not questioning, especially white people or those people who enjoy power and privilege in this particular dynamic? What are some of those big premises that you try to draw people's attention to? Oh, Derek, you're muted there.
Let's see if we can unmute Derek.
Yes.
Oh, it looks like his mic is not connected.
Oh, no. Sorry, everybody. Stand by. Technical issues. We're trying to unmute you, Derek, and it's saying your mic is not connected. I don't know if something came unplugged, perhaps.
Let's hold tight while we try to fix this. Yeah, Derek, I think your microphone is still unplugged. So,
Well, while we're communicating with Derek, trying to get him back online, so we use a program, a platform called StreamYard.
How about now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Perfect.
Awesome.
Thank you.
So-
For that, I apologize.
No, not at all. So just to bring us back to it, I had just asked if there are some particular premises that you want to draw people's attention to, or that you usually do in your work, draw their attention to.
Yeah, thank you, Brandon. There are many premises. One of them that comes to mind, hearing what you just said, is that racism is about whether we are good people or bad people. That I can't possibly be racist because I'm a good person. I can't possibly be racist because I'm a white person who's married to a Latina. I can't possibly be racist because I'm a white person who has adopted children of color. And what we understand is that it's a mistake to think about in terms of good people or bad people, because when you think about the history, racism is about one thing. Again, it's about power. And the reality is that systemic and institutional racism is about who has power and how is that power used and misused. And all of us are complicit. So central to our work is a power analysis. So another one of the misunderstandings about racism is that it does not have anything to do with power, and it's all about the individual. And so we might say, well, I don't have any power. I never owned slaves, so racism has nothing to do with me. And what we often don't understand is that there's a system in place that has given unearned power and privilege to white people. That's what racism is about. And so if you are white, you have this power, whether you accept it or not. And the question becomes, what are you going to do with it? And so in our conversations about racism, we often talk about people of color as victims. What we don't talk about is how white people benefit from systemic and institutional racism. And that's the intractable problem. And as long as we don't have that conversation, then racism is going to continue. Because one of the things we do about it is by helping, saving, and fixing those people of color. But that is also often done in a paternalistic way that is not very helpful. So even the language around things like minority and majority becomes problematic, because once we label them a minority, then we have already othered them, and our behavior towards them is going to lean in a particular direction that maintains the problematic structures. So the white folks who have the power, you might use that power to help save and fix, but seldom will that power be used to address the cause of the inequities in the first place. So the power can actually be used to maintain the problematic racist structures. And then we all become complicit in that.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is so powerful, and obviously many people, especially white people, have such a hard time hearing it. And when we translate this into kind of some of the terms that we talk about when we're talking about finite resources in terms of executive functioning, that there's only so much you can notice and only so much you can think about, and that the brain, without giving you conscious control, although certainly we can influence it, determines what things you notice and what you don't, and how people are naturally, the human brain is naturally predisposed to say, I don't want to spend resources on anything unless I have to. Right. So a lot of these conversations are bringing up things for people where it's, hey, this thing. So privilege is a word that we use a lot. And I know that a lot of people will fight over things like unearned, what makes it unearned or not, right? The way that I like to talk about privilege, and I don't know that we've actually done this on the podcast, but I've done this in presentations and things, is here's my definition of privilege. Other people have been given reason to spend their resources on things that I have not been given reason to spend my resources on. Right? That I've seen in workshops where people will put out questionnaires, for example, and ask questions like, when you enter a room, have you ever paid attention to how many people in that room share your racial or ethnic background?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
To point out to people that there are things that others spend resources on, have to pay attention to, that they don't, and they get to spend those resources other ways. So then when we try to talk to them and say, hey, you do need to spend some of your resources on this because it's a problem. You mentioned that paternalistic kind of approach. really, when we go through that charitable route, right, like that I'm doing these things because I believe that they need to be done for somebody else, people hit their limits, and then they're like, yeah, I've done enough, I don't need to do it anymore, as opposed to helping people to understand the problems that it causes for them, so that they can't just, we're not the people. Derek, you are not the problem bringing this to their attention, which many people treat it as, right, that as long as they can pacify you or not have to listen to you anymore, that the problem is resolved. But the problem is that the system itself is broken, not for charitable reasons, but because it actually harms people, and white people as well.
Absolutely. That's another thing that we don't talk about, is how racism harms white people. That's a very important point. And I also want to point out what you just said, Brandon. In the beginning, you were putting it in terms of how we as individuals participate. Well, that's very true, and that's very powerful. What we don't think about is what happens when we as individuals work collectively in those systems, right? So collectively, it's one, and this is what's problematic. It's one thing if you as an individual are involved with that, but what happens when you and several hundred or several thousand others are also participating in that same systemic oppression? Then it becomes that much more powerful and that much more difficult to address. And I don't know what the language is from your perspective or your field, but that collective action becomes so much more powerful than ours as an individual. And so we often have, and part of the socialization process is that a whole nation focuses on the individual. Right? We have these whole ideologies around rugged individualism. And I can do this on my own because I am all powerful. That's part of the construction of whiteness. And it's a lie, right? Because again, it ignores the power of those systems for us to act collectively. What is your role as an individual as part of the institution? Because then we can say, well, I don't have any power in the institution. I only have my personal power. So if I can't affect systemic change, then change cannot happen. And so that's why our work is around taking those individuals and giving them an analysis of systems and institutions to say, actually, you have a lot of power in your institution if you act collectively. And what does it mean to do that? What does it mean to think about not the harm that you're doing as an individual, but what power do you have in this institution? I think it was Alice Walker who said something like, the greatest misuse of power is by pretending that you don't have any. And that's what we often do.
Derek and Brandon, we have a commenter from the stream that there's commenting that there's just so much that we aren't taught in the current context. There's a perception amongst those who are privileged to not have it directly affect them as a distant thing. Yeah. The commenter earlier in the session also commented on just what we are not taught in schools. And as we entered this new school year, last year last episode we talked about entering the school year with COVID, but also this big discussion about critical race theory, whether or not schools are in, it's dividing people on whether or not it should be taught, or if it's stifling certain teachers' ability to have that dialogue in class.
Yeah. It's another lie, right? We are told to focus on critical race theory because there are individuals out there who are in very powerful positions, who run corporations and government, who want to keep us distracted by talking about this thing called critical race theory so that we don't notice things like the dismantling of public schools. We don't notice things like the declining test scores, or even our focus on test scores as opposed to education. We don't focus on those who gain a lot of power by having us running around thinking about this thing called critical race theory. And if you know anything about critical race theory, you know that it is a very specific conversation that typically is only held in law schools. Only taught in law schools and that kind of a context. And most of us have no idea what it means. But if you think about the impact, I've got a good friend who works with a major textbook company. And I was just talking to him last week, and he does a lot of work in the state of Tennessee. And he told me that teachers in the school district that he's working in are terrified because the state of Tennessee and other states have actually passed laws that say that you cannot teach critical race theory. Well, the reality is there is no such thing at that level of critical race theory. There's no chapter in any grade school textbook labeled critical race theory. And so if you have a conversation that says you cannot teach critical race theory, the way it gets interpreted is by teachers is I cannot talk about race. Well, if you cannot talk about race, what happens? We become ignorant. Now, if you think about the demographics of the United States, and the recent census just said that the white population in the United States is on the decline, and the people of color population is on the incline, is increasing. And so what that means is that if you think about things like redistricting and gerrymandering and power, if the population of the United States becomes increasingly black and brown, then white folks are going to lose power. And nothing can be more fearful than losing power and losing the economic benefits that comes with that. So if you can not address the demographic changes, but you can increase the power of white society over people of color, then you end up with an apartheid system, which can maintain power by the minority over the majority. Again, if you think about it systemically, if you think about it institutionally, mythology around critical race theory makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, my favorite response I've seen to that, by the way, is I saw a teacher post online that a parent said, "Are you teaching critical race theory in our elementary school?" And her response was, "Well, I don't know. Can you tell me what it is, and I'll tell you if we teach it."
Right.
And really, again, in executive functioning terms, fundamentally, that's about understanding attention as a finite resource. That if I can make something important and urgent, or interesting, but mostly important and urgent, because the brain is going to prioritize negative information. So if I make you angry or scared or upset, then that takes up your resources and you don't have things left over for the other.
That's right.
Because fundamentally, really, a lot of what you're talking about, and this is why I love communication generally, is because there are things I don't, and I know that you don't, in communicating with each other, we can develop new things. And I'm realizing how much of what you're talking about is stuff that I work on with people individually in therapy or in groups, or families or couples, where rugged individualism, for example, this idea that I can't ask for help, or even more in a more sinister way, the concept of needing help.
Yeah.
That there's a binary of some people need help and some don't. But if you ask anyone to define that, what does it mean besides you have to be suffering X amount of pain before you can ask for help?
Right.
When we're all helped all the time, nobody does anything on their own. Nobody's making their own clothes and growing their own food and building their own homes.
Right.
We're just defining some things as help and some as not. So even white people internalize these messages and then come to harm because they don't challenge it and question it, where it's coming from.
Well, white people also, it's really pernicious because it's hard to help white people understand how they are being harmed by systemic racism, because there's so many tangible, immediate benefits. So even in that conversation that you just named about rugged individualism says to people of color, you only got this job because of affirmative action. And you as an individual were deficient, so they let you in, right? But nobody talks about the fact that if you get into Harvard, you got there because of collective action and all kinds of networks that allowed you to get there. And so and I think one of the reasons that systemic racism is so powerful is because we have a difficult time believing and understanding that people can be so intentional about the things that give some power and take away power from others. And so we're able to get, and I'm sure obviously a lot more about things like addiction than I do, but I've always had a sense that how can you help white people understand that they are benefiting from systemic racism when they can't acknowledge how good it feels to be in a position of power and how fearful it can be to contemplate losing that power.
Right. Well, and of course, the whole problem with privilege, or at least oftentimes, is that it's about what you're not noticing.
Mm-hmm.
So how to get people to pay attention to the things that they've never had to pay attention to their entire lives is tricky. But go ahead, please.
I would just say, I think it's worse than that, Brandon, because I think it's not just that people don't notice, it's that the systems do a lot of work to make sure one does not notice.
Oh, sure.
So the systems become invisible to us, and we just think we're acting out of our nature without recognizing that there are all kinds of operations on us that are driving our behavior, but we don't notice because we've fallen into that notion that it's all about me as an individual, and it's quite intentional.
Yeah, there's a psychological concept we talk about called the fundamental attribution error, which basically just means that the brain determines other people are simple and I'm complex, right? So it goes in both ways, where I can say, why did my boss yell at me? Because he's a jerk. Why did I yell at somebody? Because I'm tired and stressed and this and this and that. But in the other direction too, sometimes people will do it as, why is that person successful? Because they're good and successful people. Right. Why am I successful? Well, because I've been lucky and benefited from this thing and that thing, as a way of kind of, I really think of it a lot as that internalized depression.
Yeah.
Where we find excuses for our own success that take away any ability for the brain to absorb and observe the real data that I could use to build on this or teach this to other people. Because I think of it as so external to me.
I cannot tell you, I have spent a lot of energy nurturing shame of the fact that I was well into adulthood before I realized that white people were not actually superior to me. Because my whole education, my whole upbringing in this country was around white people being inferior, and the way I absorbed and bought into those messages in a way that was so real, it never occurred to me until well into adulthood. And I also know that if we were to be honest, white people have internalized the same messages around their superiority, even though we live in a culture that will not allow us to recognize that, because again, some are benefiting and some are being harmed. And we never ask the question, how is this benefiting white folks and how is it harming people of color? Now, we will talk about how it's harming people of color so we can feel some kind of way, but that feeling some kind of way does not necessarily drive us to action, because the other part of that equation is that it feels good to be on top. It feels good to be in power, or it feels good to think that I can be in power. So even if I'm a poor white person, the notion that I may be poor, but I'm still better in the hierarchy than those people of color is enough to encourage me as an individual to work collectively with others to maintain the status quo. So I will vote against my own interests to align myself with those systems that I think will privilege me. You know, I can be poor and have nothing to do with the class of people with the kind of money of Donald Trump. But if Donald Trump tells me I'm one of you, then I may be compelled to say I'm one of you too, and it feels good.
Yeah. You know, you mentioned earlier community, working in community, and there's a particular metaphor or whatever exercise I do with people a lot, where I'll say, imagine a group of 100 people, the same 100 people in two, parallel universes, same people, same access to resources. And the difference is that in one, everyone is completely self-sufficient. They grow their own food and heal their own wounds and build their own homes. And in the other one, everyone is completely specialized. One person builds all the homes, one person grows all the food. Which of those two is going to have a better outcome? And people hesitate because I ask a lot of trick questions, and they know.
They used to do it. I'm not usually for that one, Brandon.
Yeah. Usually people will end up saying the specialist, right? And that's true if, and only if, at least one of those people or some of those people specialize in making sure that everyone's communicating well. So when people approach diversity as a charitable act, right? because we think we feel bad, right? Like you were talking about before, as opposed to, no, actually having people with different specializations, different experiences, different viewpoints is beneficial to the whole, but also requires that you spend a lot more of your effort on communicating and listening and understanding, because you cannot just learn. And this, by the way, in the context of what we're doing here, also very applicable to neurodivergent people. You can't just learn rules ahead of time. You can't say, oh, Black people like this, right? Like Black people enjoy being treated in such and such way, because every individual is different, which we try to approach through intersectionality.
Right.
So convincing people that it is in their own best interest to listen is really hard, because listening and changing requires discomfort. And it's so easy to other people, to otherize, to turn people into the other as a way to dismiss and say, no, actually the brain notices problems, right? And so if it's not a problem for you, I'm trying to draw your attention to the fact that it is. You're going to want to be able to rationalize away, no, actually, I don't think it's a problem the way that you're saying it is, so I don't have to pay attention anymore.
It's so fascinating to me to think about psychology and individual psychology and how that works with power and the misuse of power and systemic racism to just create this system of it's just so it's so tough, because I think understanding what you just said and those types of things about our individual psychology, when you match that with systemic racism, it's easy to understand why we're still dealing with this. Because I was thinking about when you talked about being uncomfortable. I thought of a conversation I often have when we start our workshops. We start with what we call a courageous conversations agreement. And sometimes we ask people, what do you think it would take to be courageous? And people will often say, I think we should be nice to each other. Or sometimes they'll say, I can have a conversation with you about racism if you would just change your language and sound nicer. And I'll often say, there's a difference between being nice and being kind. The idea of being nice is designed to make you feel uncomfortable. And the worst thing we can do in this nation is allow white people to feel uncomfortable. Because if we make white people comfortable, then we're also maintaining the status quo. We're also maintaining your power dynamic as a white person, or anybody else who is in power. And so that's quite different than being kind to each other by telling each other the truth, by recognizing our history, by recognizing the kinds of things that you're talking about, Brandon. But if we can couch it in the need to be nice, right, that's another misuse of that power. I won't listen to you. And this happens all the time with people of color. It's so frustrating, particularly in institutions. If you would just be nicer, then maybe I'll listen to you. So I need to use my power to control the narrative, to control how I hear things. And we as people of color often fall into it because historically our survival has depended on it. A whole lot of Black folks, for instance, were lynched because of making white people feel uncomfortable or them using that against us. Immigrants to this country have survived by being nice, by denying their own history in order to achieve the American dream, which is also couched in being nice and not making people feel uncomfortable. I talk to people all the time who immigrated to the United States and who came across a teacher who said to them on the first day of school, "Your name is too complicated. I'm going to call you Pat instead." And they have lived their entire adult lives under some name that was given to them because they didn't want to make white people feel uncomfortable by learning their damn names. And we don't think about those instances as an exercise in the misuse of power and controlling people of color. And this is what we're talking about around systemic racism.
When it comes to comfort or sitting with discomfort and approaching things that don't confirm our previous trains of thought on these things. I've noticed this theme, Derek, in your workshops of just sitting with this uncomfortability. But Brandon, where's that work in terms of the therapy that you provide and being able to sit with this? Because there's nothing worse than feeling like you are wrong or have been wrong, and you just want to go back to your echo chambers where you can feel like you're self-affirmed.
Right.
Yeah, well, so that's part of what's so interesting to me, because obviously you're approaching it from that kind of community organizing and workshop and institutional level, and I work with people more on an individual level. But fundamentally, it's the same, right? That we say in therapy all the time, change requires discomfort. By the very biological nature of change, in order to do things in new ways, the brain has to spend resources more than it would in order to do them in the same way. And what that means is that in order to go through or be willing to go through the process of change, the present has to be, the status quo has to be more uncomfortable for you than what you think the process of change will be. And that could be inaccurate or accurate, but that's the whole point of therapy. The entire purpose of therapy is to create a space where people can be safe, so that within that context, they can engage with discomfort and challenge. There's a term that's been used a lot more frequently lately called cognitive dissonance. And the idea of cognitive dissonance is to be able to hold two cognates, two ideas basically at the same time that are mutually exclusive. So for example, I don't have privilege, I've earned everything I've got, and okay, there are systemic and intergenerational things that contribute in ways that I can't even understand yet. So people respond to that in all different kinds of ways. And usually when people are talking about it in our, kind of social media or whatever, the discourse, people are talking about those responses, how people are going to reject data that or evidence that counters things that they already believe. Because again, if the problem is just that you're telling me there's a problem, whatever I can do to get you to stop or for me to justify not having to listen to you solves it. Whereas if you're in the right place, change, you have to be able to go through cognitive dissonance. You have to be able to know the thing that you already believe and hold the current new thing, the thing that you're being presented with, simultaneously, so that you can choose consciously to take the new one and let the old one go. So it's really this balance, and this is why I focus so much on the spending, resources, is we have to ride that balance of productive discomfort. I want to take everything else off of your plate. You can say anything to me. I'm your therapist. It's confidential. I'm not going to judge you. We have a relationship, so that now we can have a conversation about whatever thing it is that you're struggling with.
Wow, that's very interesting. In our work, we talk a lot about identity. And we often are not conscious of the many identities that we carry. It's also one of the misunderstandings about intersectionality and Kimberly Crenshaw's work, because I think many of us believe, and few of us actually read Kimberly Crenshaw. We think of intersectionality as just being all of our identities in a bag, and we can focus on one or another at any given time. She actually talks about intersectionality as how all of our various identities intersect with race and around race. My mentor used to say to me all the time, all change is experienced as loss. Doesn't matter whether it's positive change or negative change, but it is a change, and we are losing some part of our identity. And I have come to believe in my experience that one of the reasons discomfort can be so powerful is that it is a loss of some part of our identity or something that we identify with. And the part that's problematic about challenging that part of our identity is that we have no way of knowing what's going to come next. All we can feel is that we're losing something, and I'm not trying to lose anything right now. And so I think at a cellular level almost, we will hold on to identity, whether it's helping us or not. And institutions operate the same way, right? Institutions were designed, if you think about it, from the beginning of this country. What does the Constitution say? We have all kinds of laws and acts throughout the history of the United States that said this country is made for and about white people. And any challenge to that notion is going to be problematic. It could be good. We could talk about all kinds of societies that live communally. I mean, look at the rates of suicide, addiction. We are killing ourselves. We are dying. The planet is dying from systemic racism. We refuse to address it because of climate change. We refuse to get vaccines or wear masks because systemic racism has been peddled, right? It's liberal. It's the Democrats. It's these people trying to take your freedoms. We will allow ourselves to die rather than change in a way that could keep us alive. And systemic racism is at the root of that. I cannot trust what I will become, but I can trust that if I maintain the status quo, I will be safe. I will be comfortable.
That's a really fascinating way to look at it, in terms of trust. I know the status quo, and so even though it's been bad for me, or maybe it's not, right? Like, at least I know I can survive it, whereas what's next, I don't know what will happen. Because that change requires discomfort. It is really, my mentor, Andy Mahoney, the work of his career was focused around identity, and in terms of identity as a tool of expression, that we all have various ones and we interact with the world through different identities at different times.
Right.
But I've never thought of it in terms of loss, because the way I'm acting right now is shaped by your presence, Derek, and your presence, Mike. This is part of what's so powerful about community. And after this, I'll never act this way again. This identity, in whatever minor ways, will never exist again. Is a big part of what we look at with grief, is the person that I love, that I'm close with, the me that I am around them or with them is specific to that. And so when they are gone, so is that part of me, that version of me. It's literally a whole chunk of my brain, my experience, my memories that I have put resources into over the course of my life, paid attention to and built and developed, that I just no longer have a use for. And so there is this, I guess it's partly kind of sunk cost fallacy too, right? Like, it's like, well, we've come this far, we'll just keep going, even though another way would be better now.
It's a fallacy, but it's very real. For those of us who are people of color, we enter our institutions in a way that, because our institutions always want to diminish our power as people of color, we take on that diminishment as part of our identity. I can only do this. And it's reinforced every day by all kinds of microaggressions and other messages that we get around our inferiority. And as you said, Brandon, we internalize that so that it becomes our identity. So if you say to me, you actually have power that you can exercise, my internal response is, no, I don't. I don't have any power. I have developed or taken on the identity as someone who does not have any power. So then I learn over the years and generationally, because I also get this from my parents and my grandparents, that my survival is dependent on me accepting my role. I was taught as a young man growing up on the south side of Chicago that my survival depended on me deferring to white people, saying, yes, ma'am, yes, sir. I will do what you want me to do. I will not exert my power. That became part of my identity that I will spend my lifetime trying to challenge, because I have a different intellectual understanding now. And I may be very good at expressing my defiance, but even that can betray what's going on with me internally, because I don't necessarily naturally feel powerful without that inner demon that systemic racism has placed in me that makes me battle that. And even that change to a person to own my own power can be frightening. Because what would it mean to live into my power as a person of color in a racist society?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Derek, we have a question. I believe it's aimed towards you, towards the comment you just made of what was the catalyst? What caused you to realize that you were equal to our white counterparts? Was there an event, a conversation that opened the door?
Yeah, I can say that the mentor I named, his name was Reverend Juan Reed, who was the priest at the church that I went to when I moved back to Chicago 25 years ago, insisted that anybody who is a member of his church go to a Crossroads 2.5-day analysis training. And I went to that training, and it transformed my life because it forced me to re-engage my entire history up to that point. You know, my first experience when I arrived at college was a professor telling me that he did not believe I wrote a paper because, and I still remember the quote, "I do not believe a black boy from the south side of Chicago could write a paper of this quality." And he said to me, "If you really wrote this paper, I need you to prove it to me by sitting down in front of me and writing another paper of the same quality on a topic of my choosing while I watch." And to my shame, I did exactly that. I actually ended up changing my major to English. I got my first job as an adult in the English department at the University of Colorado, where my responsibilities were to tutor functionally illiterate African-American football and basketball players on the University of Colorado teams. I could tell you 100 stories that are similar from my life. I got into that Crossroads workshop, and I began to understand systemic and institutional racism. I understood that it wasn't just about an individual racist professor at the University of Colorado, and it blew my mind. And I revisited that and realized this systemic and institutional racism is a direction. And I started volunteering with Crossroads. And eventually, after I stayed at I stayed in my job for because there was another incident in the law firm where a partner I had been working with for many years called me the N-word. And that was 1 week after I attended that 2.5-day Crossroads workshop. When I went to that workshop, it just reshaped my entire life up to that point. And that's when the change happened, Mike. And that was some 15 years ago. And that's what got me on this path. That's why I do this work. Because I firmly believe in the power of understanding racism at a systemic and institutional level rather than at the personal level, which is problematic as we've discussed.
We've been, all these concepts we're talking about today, obviously we're focused on this specific application of it, but it's true in the other direction too. The good things that we're talking about, like the story you just told, that's intergenerational transmission. And that's, so I just want to share, because this is a powerful experience for me, that we talk about it in therapy, whatever happens in here happens out there, right? That this kind of mimics and brings up and allows natural things to come to the surface. So an experience that I literally just had right before that question is, my mother is white. My father is also mixed race, but not white. He's Indonesian and Chinese and African, various things. And I have always had a hard time referring to myself as a person of color because I don't want to deny my white passing privilege and act as though it doesn't exist. But the way that you phrased that just now is literally the first time in my life I ever thought of it as, no, that's me, subsuming into white culture, to say, even though I'm coming at it cognitively from a point of wanting to be respectful, but it ends up with diminishing my experience and collectively the experiences of people of color. And I don't even know what to do with that, but I'm going to process through it. Just you talking about the conversations you had, and then you having these conversations now, and is affecting me, and then the conversations that we and the listeners will have moving on, and how it will affect other people. That's the power of community, of solving things a little bit at a time, and not just sitting around and waiting and saying there's no point in doing anything because we can't do it all at once. Yeah,
Brandon, and also I think the individualism plays into it also, because I've spoken to many folks. One group of people I somehow have talked a lot to are Korean adoptees of white parents, and I've had them come to me and say, I have always identified as white because I felt like if I didn't, I would harm my parents. Because my parents said that once we adopted you, we love you, and so race does not matter. And they've said my experience going through school as a Korean in a white neighborhood were horrifying, but I could not talk about it. And I've internalized my pain because I felt like it's my struggle, my individual struggle. And once they realize that other people are struggling as well, and I give them resources of other folks in similar situations, and then they've been able to come to their own understanding that I cannot believe that I've spent my whole lifetime hating my Asian self because I thought I was defective. And I didn't realize that I can be my own person and love my parents. That it's not about my parents being white and me being Asian. It's about systemic and institutional racism that has set certain contexts and forced me to choose and participate. And once they've been able to work through that in community, they've been able to say, I am a Korean born or Korean identified person with white parents or whatever it is. And that can sometimes take a lifetime of work. But the first thing it takes is a realization that it's not just about me. It's about systems and institutions that force me to choose, right, to keep me a, quote, minority. And I have learned now to live into my own power as a mixed race person or a multiracial person or whatever it might be. And we often don't have that understanding because we end up being so isolated in many cases. And we can't talk about race in this country. So if you have that feeling and you're isolated, who are you going to talk about it with? If you think your parents will be ashamed or embarrassed, right? You can't talk to them. You can't talk to your friends because they don't necessarily understand. Few of us have an analysis of systemic racism. So there are very few places where we can have these conversations in an authentic way. So we often live so isolated and in so much pain. You know, and then there are these conversations that we often have about how did we develop racially? What was at play that made us identify as white or Asian or mixed race? We have no language for those conversations often. That's one of the things that we at Chicago World provide, a space to confront those things in a way that can be courageous, that can lead to enlightenment.
Yeah. Wow. I'm keeping an eye on our time here because, of course, I want to go and like talk about semiotics and how language shapes what we notice and conceptualize whatever. But we also try to like do some give some kind of like actionable advice to people, generally speaking, on this thing, and we often cram it in at the end because we get so into the philosophy of things. But I want to reiterate that I mean that's the foundation of what we're doing here is how important language is, that it shapes everything, and in one particular thing that you're mentioning there, that this is an actionable thing for people to pay attention to. One, I love that you said we don't have good language for it, because over and over again, I see that the problem areas are just the areas where people don't have the language to get into it further. So one particular one that you mentioned is that matter thing or care. People will say things like, I don't care that you're black, right? Which they probably, hopefully, theoretically are thinking of as you do not have less value in my eyes, or you're not worse in my eyes because you are black. But it could also be interpreted as I am not going to interact with you any differently or treat you any differently because you're black than I would someone who isn't black, which even if it's coming from good intentions, all that really means is I'm going to treat everybody as though they are white, which is, so we really don't have good language. This is something I challenge people when they're talking to their loved ones or people around them, their students, whatever, is find a way to establish better language to clarify the difference between discernment and judgment or evaluation, that I can acknowledge and understand that things are different and deserve to be thought of as different and interacted with in different ways, separate from the idea that I like one more than the other or one is better than the other.
Yes, absolutely. I think language is power. What we do in our workshops often is use those workshops to introduce language that can be helpful. And I would say, Brandon, in addition to that language, one thing that can be very helpful is to find a community, particularly a community that is developing and using the kind of language that can allow you to be courageous. Because one thing systemic racism will have us do again is to isolate ourselves in our pain, and finding a community with other people who can be brave enough or courageous enough to be authentic and use language and develop language can be extremely helpful. In fact, I think it's absolutely necessary. Find a community in which you can be comfortable and courageous and live as fully as you can possibly. Don't buy into this notion that I have to do it on my own, and if I can't, I'm defective. That's why we go to therapy, right? That's why we build community, because this toxic message of individualism is killing us.
Yeah, that I'm realizing right now that this is the first time in my life, I'm 36 years old, that I've had a conversation about race with not a single white person in the room, and it is a different experience. And especially in the neurodiversity paradigm that we talk about, the whole premise of it is that variation from a norm, any variation or distinguishing feature from one person to another, does not carry a value with it. Because that word you used, that deficient, that deficit model of I'm different from quote unquote normal, or what is most common, and therefore I'm deficient in some way,
right,
is so harmful. And I love what you're saying. Last year, especially when things really came a lot more into the national consciousness after George Floyd's murder, that a lot of the discourse started with educate yourselves, learn more, which I think is so valuable, but then got kind of through a game of telephone turned into some people interpreting it as I need to learn about all this history so that I can determine what's right and what's wrong and what should be done, as opposed to, no, we are in community and we specialize. That obviously, no matter, I think about this and work on this a lot, and I'm learning how much from you right now, that when it comes to this work, you find the people that you trust and you listen to. Right. When it comes to this work, you're one of those people for me now, And then in another field, when it's time to talk about education, you're going to listen to Mike, you and I. And when it's time to talk about psychology and therapy, the two of you will defer to me, because that's how we have finite resources as individuals. When we join in community, those resources expand with each new person. And the more that we trust each other, communicate, and follow each other's lead when it's your thing that you know more about than me, I don't need to learn on my own to confirm, what you are telling me.
That's right. And the last thing I'll say is that racism serves to destroy community and make it impossible for us to be in community. And if the question becomes, what is anti-racism? Anti-racism is about the reparation, the restoration of community. That's what we do at Chicago Roar, and that's the antidote to racism. That is, in short, what anti-racism is. What do we need to do to repair relationships, to repair community that is being destroyed by systemic racism? It used to be that I would have to talk a lot about what that means. But if we look around and see what's happening to the planet, if we look around and see what's happening with conversations around critical race theory and masks and vaccines, we can see the ways that that community is being destroyed by systemic racism. And it's not going to happen in our lifetimes, but we can all play a part in repairing community by addressing systemic racism. All the things we talked about fall under that rubric.
And just like that, we've spent an hour on the Effective Artistry podcast. I want to thank our special guest, Derek Dawson. Check out his organization at crossroadsanti-racism.org. And if you liked what you hear, come back next week, same time, same links. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to add one quick challenge and then let Derek sign off real quick. Is for those of you who are listening to this episode, and I know it's kind of silly to put this at the very end, but for those of you who are listening to this episode and at any point find yourself thinking something like, well, this isn't about neurodiversity, this isn't what I tuned in for, that right there is what we're talking about. Question that reaction of, why is this being interpreted by your brain as not as worthy of your time and attention as a discussion purely about neurodiversity, that we can see it in action. So thank you for being here, especially those of you who are still here at the end of it.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Brandon. It was an honor to be your first guest. I really appreciate the invitation. I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.